Welcome. Welcome to another episode of the Impact of AI and Data. This week's episode is supported by WILDA, Women Leaders in Data and Artificial Intelligence. Every week we explore how artificial intelligence and data impacts our lives, both professionally and personally. And today is no different. We have all the way from Germany, Laura Dohle. Did I pronounce that right?
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you. She has a very interesting topic that we're going to explore today. Laura, she started her career within art and communications, and then formally has an education in applied science. But your entire professional career has been focused in the UX design. We are absolutely grateful to have you on our show today. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. Glad to be here.
I'd like to start with your professional journey. As I mentioned, you do have this unique background with art and communications and applied science, which is very unusual to have that kind of trifecta in a formal education. And then you've been able to use all three of those throughout your professional career.
Sure. So I guess as you summed up quite nicely, my education has been a bit of a winding road until I landed where I am today. So I actually started off right out of high school going to business school, which I'm not even sure is on my LinkedIn anymore. It's so far away for me. Which I started, but I never really enjoyed. I always had an interest in product design mainly, but to be honest, like right out of high school, I could never imagine making money with something related to design, right? I couldn't imagine how I could make a living out of it. So I thought, okay, well, safe bet, you go to business school. And then I started this side project, which is, I'm not sure if that's a thing in the US as well. I think it's a global competition. It's called Formula Student, which essentially is groups of students building race cars. And then they have to like figure out a concept on how to monetize those race cars, at least in theory. So my task was to build a business plan and think about the user journey and how we could make that service desirable to people. And that's when I really realized, like, maybe this design thing is something I could make a living out of, and maybe I should give up that business thing, right? So I transferred to design school. And as you said, I started out doing communication design, which was, mainly advertising, editorial design. So I worked in advertisement and design agencies, doing campaigns and working late nights and doing advertisement pitches for clients, all of that stuff. But what happened is I was always more interested in doing more research and figuring out concepts and doing stuff that's more user-focused, which really isn't a thing in advertisement, or at least it wasn't when I worked in advertising. So I still remember one of my former bosses like pulling me aside one day saying it was an internship, and she said, like, you're good at what you do, but I really don't feel like your heart is in it. So maybe you should do something more concept heavy. And I'm not sure, like, what is concept heavy? So I tried to figure that out. And then one school, the University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam, which is close to Berlin, they offered this program, a master's in UI design, which was something that you couldn't find at a lot of other places in Germany, like specifically focused on UI design. So I applied and they took me in for my master's, and I it was mind-blowing to me, right? It was exactly what I wanted to do all those years, what I was searching for. And I worked in research facilities and medical research facilities during that time. And then my first job right out of my master's was in the sporting data industry. So like, I guess all of the jobs that I took on ever since were very data heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of years into the job, IBM announced that they were opening their IoT headquarters in Munich. And then I knew I had to get a job there, right? Because I knew there were so many talented people working there, and I just wanted to get in and learn more about data, and I wanted to learn more about IoT and AI. And thankfully, I applied, and they thought I was good for the job, and that's when I started at IBM. Initially, I created prototypes and POCs for smart and connected buildings for just to wow clients that came into the center, right? And then I transferred into product design, working on connected buildings. And that's when I really started working with data scientists quite a lot. And like from the start, when I started working with data scientists on AI project, just fascinated me, right? I thought their way of working and the stuff that they worked on was like so cool, and I hardly got any of it, but I really wanted to understand. Like, I hate not understanding what I'm working on, and that's when I started taking data science classes and trying to do a data science certificate, finish that, and now I actually work within the Watson Studio space, which means I get to hopefully improve the workflow of data scientists, which is, I guess, a dream come true for me to work on that side of things.
No, that's brilliant, because right now you are the UX design lead and advisory for Watson Studio.
Exactly. I work for Watson Studio Notebooks right now, so part of the data science workflow within Watson Studio, and trying to shape the end-to-end journey of how AI gets developed on the platform.
No, that's brilliant. And why we're talking today is, as we explore AI, we always, we talk about data bias. We talk about how, as you're collecting data, you cannot have, the proper coverage to ensure that your testing and algorithms are going to meet what those requirements are, what you're building it for. And then we talk about another set of bias with the individuals who are testing it, who, again, they see the results and they think the algorithm's working correctly, but they're not able to apply a larger perspective to ensure that we're hitting that coverage that we need. So when we think about, AI, and as we've talked about it, we're always really focused in those areas. But when I spoke to you before this, you're really looking at it from a very unique perspective, because you're looking at it from the UI, the UX, the user experience, the front end, not the back end, which is where we've been heavily focused. And you were able to identify, and this is what I'd like to explore, throughout the conversation today. You were able to identify anomalies that I'm not sure we would have been able to find if we didn't have someone like you there.
Yeah, so I guess the anecdote that I shared with you before, and I'm happy to share again here, is this is really the reason why I became so interested in the data science workflow and how to make it more user-centric, right? I was working on this project together with data scientists, and what we were trying to accomplish was to detect anomalies in a data set. And then our working hypothesis was, and we were like fairly confident about this, is those anomalies falsify some of the summary data that we're presenting to them in the UI. And we wanted to identify those, and we wanted to normalize them so they wouldn't falsify those summary values anymore. So design actually came in quite late into the project. So data science already developed a concept around it, identified the right data points and the right features to use. They created an AI that detects those anomalies, and then they would normalize them by comparing them to what they expected a certain value to be in a time series and comparing it to the actual value, and then normalizing it if it fell out of that range of expected values, right? So far so good. We then came in and we were asked to create a UI for this model to make it clear to the user what's happening with their data, right? That we detected an anomaly and that this anomaly was normalized and how it was normalized. So we did that, but what really bugged me about the process is that we didn't really know if it fit the user's mental model. Like, do they really want us to normalize that data? Is there something else about this anomaly that would be more interesting, right? I never quite put my finger on it, but something was off. So what we usually do after we finish a UI is we do user testing. And because I had this like gut feeling that we probably should look not just on the front end, but also on the back end a bit more and get some feedback on the model itself, right, and what we're doing there, is I talked to our data scientists and they were all in, like, we wanted to find a way to gather feedback, not only on the UI, but also on the model. And so we worked on a research plan together. We did usability testing, so scenario testing, which essentially means you let users perform a couple of tasks on your UI. But in addition, we also asked a couple more questions around, like, is this interesting to you? What would you expect this AI to do? Like, is there any information missing? Does this help you perform your job, right? And in the end, what came out, so we did this user testing session. The data scientist team was in there taking notes, right, asking questions. Design was in there. And it was very interesting to watch because they were sort of okay with the UI, right? Some minor things that needed improvement. But our ground truth of what we thought they wanted us to do with this AI model was so far off from what they expected.
Okay.
And what they actually wanted us to do, they found it super helpful that we identified those anomalies in their data. But what they were interested in was, why is this anomaly actually happening in the first place? And does it happen on a regular basis, right? It might not happen every day, but maybe we can find a certain frequency in which this anomaly happens. Can we categorize this anomaly? So what they wanted us to do is not normalize it per se. Maybe they wanted to decide at some point that they wanted to normalize some of those anomalies, but our assumption that we could just normalize them and that would help them have better data was like super wrong. So what came out was that we had to do a lot more work, right? Thinking about categorizing those anomalies, giving them the option to also say we don't want to normalize those anomalies or only normalize certain anomalies, dig deeper into what's actually happening, find categories for the different anomalies, stuff we haven't even considered, right? And this is what really like stayed with me, because from talking to other people on other teams, what I realized was that even though data science and design work really similarly in the sense of we try to identify a problem, right? And then we're trying to find a solution on it. When it comes to then going back and trying to see if that solution actually solves the real user problem, that's where we really deviate. And where also designing on AI project really deviates from maybe other design projects, because you don't do this, fail early and often and fail forward type thing, where you constantly test with our users. And what I found interesting is one reason why we're not doing this is also because we don't know how to do it, right? We're missing the framework. How could I how could I test an AI model with a user if there's no UI yet? Or how could I test the features that I decided I would use for an AI with the user? How would I get feedback that I could actually implement? Because they are so complex, right? They are so far off from the final experience. And yeah, I really became interested in that. And that's actually something that me and a couple of other folks are now starting to work on to figure out how we could bring that into our process, creating AI experiences at IBM.
I have a couple questions for you. So earlier in my career, I was a developer, and really early in my career, like a long time ago. And as a part of that, we would develop something. We would, put a very thin UI on it just so we could get the data into, some sort of format to let the user see it. But when you talk about it in a way that it's not just here's a way to present the information. It sounds like you're looking at it from a much broader and deeper perspective.
I guess you could say that, right? What I essentially want to get to is having different checkpoints within our AI development process where we gather that user feedback and then use it to iterate on our current stand of the process, right? In design, we talk about lo-fi to hi-fi, I guess, and my interest lies in how can we identify this lo-fi to hi-fi in an AI modeling process, and how could we not just like show an interface, but ask questions that go deeper, right? Do those features that we're using for your AI, or does that data really match your decision process of doing the task themselves? Because a lot of times we're helping them and we're augmenting them doing tasks that they do for a long time, those users, and just doing them better and easier and faster. But they have a mental model about how this should be done. And sometimes that mental model needs to change. That's one case. But also sometimes we need to apply this mental model to the stuff that we're doing because they have years of knowledge that we don't even have around the topic that we're trying to create that AI for.
Do you believe that in whether it's this scenario or any other scenario, when we begin some type of project like this, we always are looking to find out what's the business challenge? What are we trying to solve? What's the whole point of why we're here?
Yeah.
In the scenario that you've illustrated, is part of some of the things that you were finding a result of we didn't clearly identify or understand the business challenge? Or is it, no, the business challenge was pretty clear, but as we continued the journey, seeing those results is what prompted the range that you were identifying?
I guess what, sorry, the thing that I would define is, one thing is the business challenge, right? And those are oftentimes fairly clear. So we know the business challenge of a project going in, but what's unclear is the user challenge, right? And if you don't consider both of those, so like how does whatever we come up with translate into business goals, but also how does it translate into user goals? For business, it's usually around like, right, saving certain amounts of money or making the process faster. But users, the people that actually like use the product in the end, they might have totally different goals. If you think about like someone working in insurance, right? The insurance company might want to save money on a certain process, deciding who gets money for an accident or whatever, and who doesn't. But that user is more interested in like, are the results right? Am I saving time in my day? Can I trust this outcome of this AI? Does it match how I'm doing my job? Does it fit into my workflow? And these are the things that we're not always considering, right? So even though we might match the business goal, we're so far off from the user goal, not always, but sometimes, that even though this thing would technically be helpful from a business perspective, people don't want to use it. And that is like my point of view where I want to improve the process.
Are you familiar with the term model drift?
Yes.
Okay. So the question here is, as an AI model, moves into production, and as the users are, and this is in this scenario, you weren't involved in this scenario, and as that model is being used by the users, there's this variance that occurs where what we expected to happen is not how it's being used, and therefore we go into this post-production maintenance model where we're maybe getting additional data that we recognized was missing, or maybe how the UI is being used and how the user understands the context of that AI model. We go back and reconfigure some of the algorithms to make those adjustments. So the concept of model drift is adjustments over time. But I think what I'm interested in understanding from you is that in the scenario that you've illustrated, would you consider, or have you been able to document that if you're involved or someone like you is involved, does that post-production model drift still exist, or it still exists, but perhaps it's smaller?
Well, we hope it's smaller. We're at a point in this process where we are pretty much admiring the problem. We don't have a solution yet. We're very much, it's very much work in progress, right? So what is interesting to me, though, is there are some best practices around gathering user feedback in the pre-production process. I mean, Google has their data and AI framework where they talk a lot about implementing a feedback loop into the AI, and other companies have the same thing. But a lot of AIs don't consider user feedback when in the pre-production process, right? It's not included in the loop. It doesn't change the model. So even though there's best practices there, it doesn't get adopted a lot of times, or it's so hidden in the UI that it's very hard for users to find and give that feedback if they see that models drift, or they are not doing what's expected anymore. What we're trying to focus on right now is more of the pre-production state, and because there is no user feedback loop in there at all at this point, at least not from a best practice perspective. It's more like individual teams are doing it, but there's no formal process around it. And but what I expect is a lot of the things that we could come up with here could also inform what's happening in pre-production, right? And how we could make that better as well.
Which would then mitigate some of the expectations that you're going to have a model drift. But if I look at it, if I think about what you're saying further down the line, we tend to have a dedicated group of resources in our analytics, team, not focused on pre-production or production, but focused on that post-production, that maintenance. So if there's a way that we could front load some of the experiences that you've illustrated here, that not only, as we mentioned, perhaps we expect it to minimize that post-model drift, but it also, A, increases user adoption, which is brilliant. B, is going to, obviously pull in a much higher return on investment. But if we keep going further down the line, it also sounds like it could help us with our resource allocation, focusing those resources on something a little bit more important than having to constantly maintain those models. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking out loud, but I could see a whole host of benefits. And I think what's interesting is when I'm doing an implementation in my digital transformation, business transformation world, one of the things that I'm always talking about is we need to obsess over the stakeholder. We need to be obsessive about what they want and try to fold that into the testing. But it's, until having this conversation with you, I never really, like the light bulb goes off. Why aren't we doing that in our AI, models, in our AI testing as well? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I truly believe it will make monitoring models easier as well, right? And save some resources there too,
Do you
to
have,
think about it from the start.
I was thinking, do you have some lessons learned? Like if I'm, for the folks that are listening that are actually in the data analytics and the data science and all of those teams out there, do you have some lessons learned or maybe some types of questions that you would typically just ask the end user to help with that?
I guess, first of all, if you are a data scientist or a designer, and you both work on the same project, like work together, you should be joined at the hip, right? And also try to learn more about each other's discipline, because I really think that the closer we work together, the easier it is for us to think about and integrate this user-centric view into the AI process. So for me personally, it really helped like taking data science classes to really understand what people are talking about, because it's very technical, right? And for designers, it's easy to get lost in like the naive Bayes and tree decision tree, and I don't know, like all this terminology being thrown around, and you don't quite have a concept for it, and so you never can form an opinion on it. It's important to at least know enough to ask the right questions. So that is something that I would definitely recommend. And also as a data scientist, learn about usability testing. There's so many methodologies out there that could also function for abstract concepts like models or features, and get creative about it. What else? I think that's really the most important learning for me, was like really learn about each other's disciplines.
What if not everybody has someone like you?
Yeah.
Which is going to be the most common. Are we then saying that it's the folks that are in the analytic stage, the ones that are building those analytics, the ones that are formalizing the testing strategy of the AI models? It sounds like it's really their responsibility to think about testing, not just from here's how my model is working and is it working appropriately based on the requirement, but it sounds like we're saying that if we don't have someone like you, a UI designer or a UX designer, that it's that person's role to think about the end user as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you test the model, I think it should go beyond testing for accuracy, right? Mm-hmm. That's one thing. But a model can be super accurate, but if the user problem you're basing it on is the wrong user problem, it doesn't help you, right? It won't solve anything. So thinking about qualitative feedback from your clients and from your users, and how you could integrate that into your quantitative accuracy data, and take both of those into consideration when deciding on which model to use and which algorithm to use and which features to choose, is also, I guess, very important. One project that I worked on, right, we chose a feature, and the client actually, like, the actual end user that used this model, they didn't understand what this feature was, right? It was too complex. It was never something that they, with, the cognitive capabilities of one human being, could ever grasp. So even though it was technically right, they wouldn't use it. So we took it off of the AI model, and maybe the model wasn't as accurate anymore, but it was more usable to them and they had more trust in it. So it's all things to consider. Being a designer or not being a designer, I think that's important.
So as we start to wrap up, when we're at that stage where we're doing the testing, is there, for example, like a rule of thumb, like you should have X amount of users available, or there's certain questions that these testing folks, should be asking? Because keep in mind, we're talking, to people that have been so focused the last 3 or 4 years in just testing. How do we get them out of that mindset? What are some things that they could have a little cheat sheet with?
Yeah, I guess what's important is to bring your model back into the real world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take it out of that data science world and bring it back into the actual world that the user is going to use it in. And what we always found very helpful is scenario-based user testing. So if you're trying to solve a problem of, I can't think of one right now, maybe movie recommendations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Try to have them solve that task that they would solve without the AI anyways, right? So try and find a movie recommendation using our interface that has this AI built into it, right? And then they walk through, you'll see they think out loud, you'll actually see your AI in action, which is painful. Like for me, testing UIs and you're not allowed to say anything or bias them, you always find out new stuff and you can never say anything, but you're sitting there watching, like, press that button, but they can't find it, right? And you think you made it so obvious, but they can't, right? Same for the AI. You think, this is what you want. This is the movie that you should watch based on all the things that the AI considers. But in the end, they might not find that movie enjoyable, or it's not what they expected. So this scenario-based usability testing or user testing is always quite helpful. It enables you to identify user problems, and it helps you to identify the severity, also rank them by severity, right? Weren't they able to perform the task at all, or was it just a little complicated? And then you can just go through those issues one by one. That's something that I found super helpful. And another thing to mention, because I always hear that quite a lot, like, however, your prototype on how you test can be super basic, right? You just need to be able to get results and get user feedback. It doesn't need to be like a high fidelity UI that you're testing with. It could be pen and paper. It could be paper prototypes or a couple of screenshots or whatever, right? Sketches. Everything that allows you to kind of represent what you want to solve and get feedback. And I guess we also have to get this creative with like low fidelity AI artifacts.
Laura, this was awesome. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you for again, the time zones. It's always appreciative when we're early in the Eastern time zone and we've got folks in Europe and the rest of the world that set aside their time to talk with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.